Hi, I'm Elaine Petruccelli, and I am the president and founder of Book Passage. And I am so honored tonight to have two of the people whom I admire so much in our store. When I heard that Book Passage had a chance to have Dr. John B. King here, I was, well, we were kind of pushy with the publisher and made it really clear that we had to have this man here. And we did, because everything we look for, believe, the successes that we can have and what we can do for our country and our children is uh, all embodied in these two people on the stage today. You can read all about John King, so I am not going to tell you where he went to elementary school or that he went to Harvard, because I used to not say Harvard, but now they're turning into brave, brave people. Even though in the book there was a little part where I thought, but as you all know, Dr. King uh, came through not an easy life. He has written this amazing memoir. It is riveting. It's the word I would use. As one thing after another happens, and we see how this life builds, and also whatever you do, don't skip to the ending, but wait till you get to the last chapter. It is one of those things that just is shockingly beautiful. And uh, I thank you, Dr. King, for everything you've done for education, for your time as the Secretary of Education back when there was a goal to have education. But thanks to you as the head of the SUNY whole New York State public college system and your work with the government and foundations, I have hope. So we're so happy you're here. And of course, the first thing I said to the people here was we have to tell the publisher about Kim Mazzuca. Then maybe they'll say we can get chosen. And we got chosen. And as you may know, I know there are some people here who have known Kim a long time. I met Kim right after she came here. And some of you know the story that uh, we started talking about what Book Passage and 10,000 Degrees, then the Marin Education Fund, could do together. And what Kim said, could we ever have an event together? And I said, well, what would be your dream event? And she said, well, Barack Obama would. And I said, well, he has a new book coming out. Anything's possible. And he came to us, and it was just a couple of months before he said he admitted that he was running, and he was the flavor of the week. It was amazing. And he called and he asked us, what would you like me to talk about? This organization looks fantastic. And I said, I'd like you to talk about education as much as you can. And he talked to all the young people we had about 200 young people. But this is an example of who Kim Mazzuca is. She thinks, she reaches for what is anybody else would say, oh, that'd be too much work. And because of that, so many young people have gone on to college, finished, and have incredible lives today. And so, Kim, before I get teary, I just want to thank you and Dr. King for what you have done for us and for our country. I got your mic. Let's give you a mic. I thought it was going to pass. Okay. Sorry, people at home.
There we go. So let me first say what an honor it is. I so enjoyed getting to know you, reading your book, and getting to know your family. But to be able to sit here with you this evening, what an honor it is to have this conversation. And tonight, I have a whole set of questions that I want to ask Dr. King. I was very moved by what you had to say in your book, but we are going to allow about 20 minutes towards the end of our session to take questions from the audience. As Elaine said, this is a very powerful, and it's a very powerful memoir, but it's so much more than that. And it is about the power, the transformative power of education and mentoring. And I would say that every teacher, every mentor, every person who works with young people needs to read this book. And it should be in the curriculum, even at Columbia University. And when you read the book, you'll know why I said that. There are so many takeaways from this book, not only from the power of mentors and teachers, but the potential of our schools, to how we think about our identities and our purpose in life, to our role in creating a more equitable and just place for our families, and so germane to today's time, to our democracy. And I know some of you came out here tonight because in this time, we need to connect with people of like-mindedness who believe we can be better and who believe in our democracy and who believe in hope. And I would say that the one thing that gives us the greatest hope in our country, it's our young people. One of the big takeaways from this book is the power that each of us have as an adult and the impact that we can have on a young person in a moment's time and the gravity of that impact. And so I believe that we as adults, we can and we need to do better. And that's why I think everybody should read this book. There's something that you said in one of your chapters, and I underlined this. As you can see, I've dog-eared and I've underlined quite a bit. But it said, I had wanted someone to step in and understand what I needed when I could not find the words or the courage to ask. And that is what I think is so important for every adult out there, to when we cross paths with young people, that we can ask those questions and pay attention to the quiet ones. And I think this book is also about how we create a pipeline of teachers so that students can see themselves and that they, the mentors, can then instill a love of reading and learning and school. And so that is why I think everybody needs to read this book. So I will ask, before we get started, that every one of you purchase a second book tonight and that you give that to somebody that you know. Maybe it's a young person aspiring to be a teacher. Take it back to your school and have it be part of your teacher development program. So Dr. King, I'd like to begin with chapter 1, and then we'll end with chapter 12. In fact, I'm going to read an excerpt from page 192, if you don't mind. If I can get there. I took over from Arnie on January 1st, but I was officially confirmed by the U.S. Senate on March 14th and formally sworn in on April 16th. Then Vice President Joe Biden administered the oath of office in a century-old room that once served as the Navy's library in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, as those who mattered most to me looked on. My family, close friends, and colleagues from across the years and miles were there to witness it. One of them was there to bear witness when I became the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. Can you talk about who that was and all of the beautiful people that you talk about in chapter 1 that started you off on this journey to share your story?
Sure. And thanks, Kim, for having this conversation, and I'm grateful to Elaine and Book Passage for having us. So, one of the best moments of that day, being sworn in as secretary, was having my 4th grade teacher there with me. Alan Osterweil, who was my teacher in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And if not for Mr. Osterweil, that day would not have been possible. I was in his class when my mom passed away in October of my 4th grade year. I was 8 years old. And after my mom passed, I lived with my dad, who was struggling with Alzheimer's. And nobody knew. It was just the two of us. And so home was this environment that was chaotic, unstable, scary a lot of the time. But the thing that sustained me through that period was Mr. Osterweil's classroom. And I remember the things we did in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, like it was yesterday. I describe a lot of them in the book. We read the New York Times every day. We did productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in elementary school. We did a production of Alice in Wonderland, where I was the rose with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. We learned the leader and capital of every country in the world. And we took these amazing field trips. I mean, he really took seriously the role of the elementary school teacher as students' guide to the world. And we went to the Museum of Natural History and to the ballet, and he exposed us to this whole world beyond Canarsie, Brooklyn. And truly during that period, there were times when I didn't know if I could keep going because home was so difficult. But in Mr. Osterweil's class, I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. And so to be able to say thank you to him at the swearing in was just a profound experience. And also I will say Vice President Biden, later President Biden, was so excited to meet Mr. Osterweil and just he was so enthusiastic about Mr. Osterweil and about teachers, and of course talked about Jill Biden and her career as a teacher. So it was a wonderful celebration of teaching. And also to me, I hope one of the things that it will signal to young people who read this book is there can be these periods in your life that are very dark, where it can feel very hopeless, but it can get better. And for me, it really did.
Thank you for sharing that. Can you talk a little bit about Miss D?
Sure. So Mr. Osterweil, he looped with us, which was very unusual, and stayed with us 4th, 5th, 6th grade at PS 276 in Canarsie. And then in those days, elementary school ended at 6th grade. And so I went to Mark Twain Junior High School in Coney Island. And at that point, my father was very sick. And as he got more sick, home became much more difficult. He stopped going to the store. I remember being so indescribably hungry till I figured out how to get food into our house. He stopped paying the bills, and I figured out how to forge his signature so that I could keep our household going. And I would worry. I would sit in class and I would just worry about what was that night going to be like. I describe in the book one night when he woke me up at 2 a.m, told me it was time to go to school. And he was so insistent that it was time to go to school. And I remember being on the staircase in our house, clinging to the banister as my father pulled me on the stairs. And I'm saying to him, "No, Daddy, it's not time to go to school. It's not time to go to school." And he didn't understand. I didn't understand why he thought it was time to go to school. And we were just there kind of tussling on the stairs until he just gave up and he went to sleep. And I went to sleep and I went to school the next day. And there was no explanation of why that happened. That's what home was like. Some nights he'd be sad, other nights angry, sometimes violent. And I would sit in class worrying, was this going to be one of those nights? Was he okay? Why? He was a chain smoker for a very long time. Was something going to happen in our house? Was it safe in our house? And I would think about that all the time. But in Miss D's 7th grade social studies class, I was just focused on the things we were learning in Miss D's class. I remember I describe in the book this incredible lesson where we did a Aztec newscast, and I was the Aztec sportscaster, right? And in that moment, in Miss D's class, and she was this amazing teacher, my first African American teacher. She was a part-time actress. She had a huge personality. And in Miss D's class on that day, the thing that mattered most in the world to me was to be the best Aztec sportscaster there had ever been, right? And that was such a gift. She didn't know all the things that were going on at home for me, but it was such a gift to have that space to be a kid in her classroom. Funnily enough, years later, when I was state education commissioner in New York, I went back to Mark Twain Junior High School to be principal for a day. Miss D was still teaching in the same classroom, and in classic social studies teacher fashion, I walk in and she sees me, and she says, "I have something to show you." And she jumps up and she goes over to these huge cabinets at the back of her classroom. It's like Miss Frizzle, And she gets on a chair, and I'm nervous, like, is it stable? And she's rifling through these things above the cabinet. She pulls down the poster from our Aztec newscast with pictures of each of us, and then proceeds to tell me about the students she's been in touch with and what they're up to. But that kind of passion for enriching, engaging, compelling classroom experiences. If not for that, I wouldn't be sitting here today. And so the combination of Mr. Oswald and then going to Miss D's class really sustained me through that period. And my dad ended up passing away when I was 12. I moved around after that, different family members, different schools, but the role of teacher was so central to sort of my being able to make it through all of that.
There's so many places we could go with some questions here. There's so many mentors and influencers that you talk about in your book. Some were teachers, some were professional mentors, family members. But I think the place that if we could go now is what you just described. Is you talk about joy in your book. Mm-hmm. And and you've had an amazing career with the different positions that you've held over time. But you always talk about the classroom being your North Star. And I'm reminded of Jabali, who you talk about, who brought such joy to the classroom. And I think about today how overwhelmed our teachers are and our schools, and how many children they have to teach, and with fewer resources by the day. How can our teachers bring more joy into their classroom with the limit in resources that they have, and given what's going on in the world, and our students becoming even more under-resourced? This is a huge challenge that we have put an incredible burden on our teachers. So how do we make the classroom like the North Star for all of our students, so they can find relief and comfort and joy? And how do our teachers help create that?
It's such a powerful question. And look, at the end of the day, let's be clear, we shouldn't create such a difficult situation for our teachers, right? Those are choices. We make the choice to concentrate our students with the highest poverty, with the highest needs in a subset of our schools. We make the choice to under-resource those schools. We make the choice here in California that I think the ratio of students to counselors is like 400 to 1. That's a choice, right? That's a reflection of our lack of political will. It's a reflection that we aren't as committed as I believe we should be to the idea that school should be this place of learning and joy for every child. So stipulating that, even in that circumstance, I think the question for any teacher is, how do I create a classroom environment that is at once academically rigorous and filled with the joy of learning and the relationships that make student success possible? And sometimes those are framed in opposition to each other. Like that academic rigor has to be joyless. And I tell the story in the book of some teachers that I have seen firsthand as colleagues who are able to strike that right balance. So Jabali, who you mentioned, he's teaching 6th grade science. And one day kids walk into the classroom and he's converted the classroom into a plant cell, right? With all the different elements, Golgi bodies and whatnot. And student, or maybe it was an animal cell, now I'm forgetting. As students come in, the room is set up in this way that gets them excited about learning the parts of a cell, right? You could see how that could be an incredibly dry, read this passage, memorize these terms. But he understood that part of the goal is to have that hook, the thing that makes kids excited about learning. And that is doable even in an environment that is stressful and challenging and under-resourced. We can still find the ways to do that. For the English teacher, that one passage in the book that evokes emotion, like let's talk about that passage. Let's act out that scene from a play. Like let's find that thing that's going to get kids curious to want to learn the next thing. And the other thing that Jabali was so intentional about was building relationships with kids, right? Because so much of kids' connection to school depends on their relationship with their teachers and that sense of being seen. There's that saying, I don't care what you know until I know that you care. Right? And if students feel that the teacher's curious. Remember, Mr. Ostrow would always ask us, I mentioned we read the New York Times every day, and he wanted to know, what did we think about the Cold War? What did we think the United States should be doing about famine in Africa? And he wasn't asking just so he could give us an answer. He was asking because he was genuinely curious what we thought. And knowing that he valued us in that way made us more eager to learn.
So I have to ask, on the other side of all these wonderful mentors and tutors and influencers, was there anybody in your life who wasn't necessarily out in the professional field, who wasn't necessarily the best influencer? And how did you, as a young person, navigate that? What did you do with that negativity as opposed to letting it fester and start to create a negative narrative? How did you overcome that?
Yeah. Well, I didn't always, right? And so, in high school, after my dad passed, I was living with my brother, who was 24. I was 12. It sounds like the setup of a sitcom, but it was not that good. It was incredibly loving for him to try to take care of me, and he drank all the time, partied all the time, and had no business having a 12-year-old, and did not go well. So I decided I needed to get out of that situation because it felt, in many ways, as unstable as much of my childhood had been, and I knew that I needed to get out of it. So I had a classmate from elementary school who'd gone to a fancy private school, Groton, in Massachusetts, and he told me about it, and it seemed like he was having a great experience. So I decided that was going to be my solution to get out of the situation with my brother. So I went to Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass, where George H.W. Bush went and George W. Bush went, just to give you a sense of the kind of school it is. And I really struggled there. I was, as a kid from Brooklyn, as one of this relatively small number of kids of color, I was very out of place. And it was the first time that I confronted teachers who I felt like weren't invested in me and my success. And that was confusing in some ways for me, because I'd always seen teachers as allies. And I found some at Andover. But I also had a teacher, I just tell the story in the book, of we were talking about Cecil Rhodes and the history of the Rhodes Scholarship. And I being, as I was kind of had an emerging social justice views, I said, well, I would never want a Rhodes Scholarship because of how that came about and where the money was from. And the teacher he got into an argument with me and he was dismissive. Right? I mean, it's one thing, as a high school teacher, you sometimes do get into an argument with kids because you're trying to push them on their ideas. This wasn't that. This was dismissive in a way of like, oh, how naive. And I felt that. And it was in some ways representative of a feeling I often had there of like, the school was doing us a favor for students of color to be there. And I really struggled with that. And I was also struggling with all the trauma I'd experienced as a kid and being a very angry teenager. And so I got in a lot of trouble. I got kicked out of Andover. The first Secretary of Education had been kicked out of high school, right? And so I didn't have good strategies to process my own anger, and I didn't have good strategies to process feeling othered in that way. Later, I think over time in my career, I've developed maybe more strategies of resilience and also the self-awareness that, particularly in leadership roles, the critics, the opponents, often have something very useful to tell you. And I've tried now in my leadership work to be disciplined that even if a person is yelling at you, even if they seem unreasonable in how they communicate their objections or critique, there is real value in having the discipline to listen and ask, what's motivating them? What's the source of their frustration? What do they need? What could be different about this situation that would help get it to a better place? And so that's something I've learned over time, and I've been fortunate to have mentors who have helped me try to do that. And I'd like to think that even in an interaction with a teacher like the one who dismissed me in high school, I'd have more strategies than just being angry.
I don't want to give the ending of the book away, but as you're describing this, what I think about is the space and the listening you did with such care when you met the family who lived in the, I'm trying to remember the name of the farm now, Edge Hill in
Gaithersburg, Maryland. Yeah.
And there was a part of me when I read that, I thought, how did you do that? Not go there, but how were you able to leave there saying to yourself that you wanted to continue to listen to where they were coming from? So maybe you have to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah,
and that is chapter 12.
Okay, that's okay.
But I will share with you that this, all the way through getting to know Dr. King through your words, through all these mentors and influencers, chapter 12 is, as Elaine said, it was so, I just felt it in my heart. And so you have to definitely read. You cannot read the end of the book first. You have to start at the beginning. But can you share a little bit about what I'm referring to around listening to other people? And
so, chapter 12 describes this extraordinary journey that our family has experienced over the last few years, building a relationship with the family who are direct line descendants of the family that enslaved our family. And how this happened was when I was secretary, University of Maryland Eastern Shore, HBCU, reached out to me to ask me to give the commencement address because my grandmother graduated from there in 1894. And to prepare for this commencement address, I decided I need to do a family history research project. I wanted to give more context to my grandmother being there amongst the first graduates of this school. And so a friend of a friend was a genealogist at the Schomburg, the part of the New York City Public Library that does work around African American history. And so she took on this project kind of for fun, out of curiosity, and helped me as I tried to piece together our family history. And one day I'm sitting on the couch with my family, we're watching TV, and we get this email. I found the place where your great-grandfather was enslaved. Now think about that. There are kids right now being babysat by their great-grandfather. It's a reminder of how close we are to that institution, the institution of slavery. Found the place where your great-grandfather was enslaved. And oh, by the way, it's about 25 miles from where you live. We lived in Silver Spring. The property was in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And oh, by the way, the cabin that your great-grandfather lived in as an enslaved person, still standing on the property. And the property is still owned by the family that are direct line descendants of the family that enslaved your family. So, as an African American, there is this connection to the institution of slavery, but you don't think you're going to be able to stand in the place. So then the question was, well, what do you do with this information? Do you call ahead? Do you send an email? Right? Like, what's the methodology to make this introduction? And my cousin, about a week later, was in D.C. And went to the new Smithsonian African American History Museum, and they have a cabin there that was the quarters for enslaved people. And so when she saw that, she just said, I have to go see this. And I think her husband was a little reluctant, but she said it's going to be fine. And so they drove out to the property, they knocked on the door, and Jan said, our people were enslaved here. And that started this journey of building a relationship with the family, the Beckers. And to their credit, they were very open to building a relationship with us. But it's been a real education for me about the work we still need to do as a country to reckon with the institution of slavery and its legacy. One of the things that's striking, and that I talk about in this chapter, is that despite growing up amongst the artifacts of the institution of slavery, until they met us, the Beckers had not spent a lot of time thinking about the institution of slavery. And so that's been a part of our journey together. At one point, they said to us, we hope our people were not cruel to your people. And I knew exactly what they meant. We hope that our ancestors did not torture your ancestors. But the problem with that is slavery is torture. They were cruel. Owning other people is cruel. And to give you a sense, the cabin is 30 feet from the main house, right? So imagine, that desk over there, that's where the main house is from the cabin. These were two families living in the same physical space, one owning the other. And so trying to work that through with them, and also work it through ourselves, right? To stand inside of that cabin and contemplate that our existence is because of the perseverance of our ancestors, because they lived with faith in a future they could not see. Right? To grapple with that, and then to build this relationship where we've had a lot of hard conversations about our shared history. But I will say, the Beckers have been very open to it. They use the cabin, which they called the quarters, as storage until they met us. And as they've gotten to know us, they cleaned out the cabin. They see it more as a historical artifact in a way that they didn't before. So it's been a fascinating journey, and I hope that part of what people take away from the book is an invitation for us as a country to have these hard conversations in a moment when there are some people who would argue, let's cover that up. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's erase those stories. I think to the contrary, we should actually engage in these hard conversations about our journey, because at the end of the day, our journey is, yes, one of shortcomings and failings, but it's also one of tremendous progress. Right? When I'm standing inside of that cabin, one of the things I'm deeply conscious of is that in my family, we went in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first black president. And that we shouldn't run from that story. We should embrace that story as an illustration both of our shortcomings and our potential for progress.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Okay, so I have a couple of other questions, and then I think we should open up to the audience because we have up until 7 here. Already answered that question. I guess beyond academics, you emphasize schools as places of survival and healing and hope. And I guess we have a lot of educators in the room tonight. What are the most crucial non-academic roles that teachers play in students' lives, especially for those facing significant challenges outside of school?
And there are so many, right? I mean, even to the level of just helping students who are struggling with basic needs insecurity, right? There are the teachers who bring in the snacks because they know that kids will come to school not having had breakfast. There are the teachers who take kids to their college interview because there's not someone who's going to do that. Teachers who sit with students and help them do their college application because there isn't someone who would do that. Teachers who are helping students figure out how to navigate impossibly difficult situations at home. So there's all the kind of concrete support that teachers are providing, but then there's the emotional relationships, the sense of trust. For some kids, the classroom environment is the most stable environment in their lives, as it was for me. And for some kids, their teachers are the most stable adults that they are interacting with on a regular basis, as they were for me. And that's a tremendous responsibility that teachers then carry. And one of the challenges that's created by our deeply socioeconomically segregated schools is that we concentrate the students who are most likely to have had trauma at home in a subset of schools. So it's one thing if you're a teacher and you have 25 kids and 3 of them are going through a thing, right? Because you can intervene with those 3 kids. But where you have classrooms where there are 25 kids and 24 of them are going through a thing, whether it's violence in the community or substance abuse or domestic violence in their home, or parents who are struggling with addiction, or parents who are struggling with mental health issues, or just the ravages of poverty and the impact that has on people's everyday lives. So having all of that in one classroom is incredibly overwhelming for a teacher. But every day, teachers all across America are figuring out how to respond to those socio-emotional needs of their students. The other thing I would say is teachers also are a source of hope for kids. Because, I'm very conscious of this from my own experience. I didn't have other reasons to be hopeful. The things in my life were sending a very dark message. But in school, I saw possibility. And that is such a gift that teachers are giving every day to students all across the country.
So here in California, we have probably the largest student population probably out of any other state in the Union. Most ethnically and economically diverse. Huge academic opportunity disparities and growing. And we know the way schools are financed. It's a huge systemic issue. I mean, I'm just kind of curious, like, how long do we go on like this? Or what is the policy lever? Because we know that that's where the greatest change can be. What if you had a recommendation to the state of California? What is the first policy lever that you would want to pull for us to do a whole lot better? And we need to, and we can't just put it on all of the teachers in our classrooms.
It's so hard because I ultimately don't believe there is a single silver bullet, but fulfilling the promise of Brown versus Board of Education would be a good start. And the truth is, we just never did that as a country. And if you look at the data, when we were making progress, painful progress towards the vision of Brown, when we were making progress towards more racially and socioeconomically integrated schools, we made tremendous academic gains for the most vulnerable young people without harm to the performance of more affluent students, without harm to the performance of white students, right? We were making progress. Now that all stopped, and really, there was a series of challenging court decisions, and then the Reagan administration really abandoned the role of the federal government in supporting progress towards fulfilling Brown. But I think the lessons of Brown remain that, for example, in New York, we have 700 school districts. On Long Island alone, there are about 120 school districts. And those school districts track lines of race and class. And so not surprisingly, the less resourced schools are the schools that serve the largest numbers of low-income students and students of color. In contrast, when I lived in Maryland, in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I lived, having a county system actually was much better because the more affluent parts of the county subsidized the lower income parts of the county. All kids had the benefit of the range of opportunities that the most affluent families were insisting on for their kids. So that's where I'd start. But there's so many things we need to do. Why do we not have universal early childhood programs for 3 and 4-year-olds? Why don't we tell prospective teachers that if you're willing to commit to teach in a high needs community or a high needs subject, we'll pay for higher education for you, right? We have public service loan forgiveness, but that's years out. But why not say up front, if you'll make this commitment to serve your country and your community, we're going to be committed to you and we're going to make education free for you. So there's a lot of things that we need to do. But again, fulfilling Brown would be a good start.
I think here in Marin, we have how many school districts for 17 for how many students? So we wanted to start locally. I always say we need to start with the school boards too. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think, well, maybe we should go on to the audience because it is almost 6:45. But thank you for answering all those questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I would love to invite the educators in the room. Please, questions.
Not so much a question, but a comment. I remember where I know you from now. We met in 2012, right after or thereabouts, after you became the cabinet secretary. I was in DC for a meeting on financial literacy for educators, and you were sent to speak to us, or you were in the room and you represented the federal government because President Obama couldn't make the event because something else had happened somewhere in the Middle East, just for context. So when you spoke to the audience, it was very inspirational. And I can tell you that lockstep, we've had almost a similar life path. And I am where I am as a commissioner in the state of California. I'm a public school teacher. I also teach with my colleagues here at Stanford and through Cal Berkeley and UCLA because of walking in your footsteps. And I wanted to say thank you for being you and being that pioneer, because as a kid who grew up in Compton and Watts, as a homeless child, and the first in my community to integrate schools in West Los Angeles, school buses. It's a big deal to see someone in your position who represents people like me. I can see myself aspiring to those higher offices, and that is why I am where I am. 5 college degrees later, and all of the things that we can talk about in exchange for success. I just again want to say thank you and tip my hat to you, the California Black Educators Initiative hat, because that is also something else that we've started because we know that children in the state of California need to have teachers who look like them and who represent their interests also in classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for what you do for your students.
As the child of Irene Jones, who taught for 39 years, 6th grade, and was part-time librarian without extra pay in rural Georgia, thank you for everything that you are for education and for humanity. I have a scenario for you. If tomorrow, in another world, you were appointed as Minister of Reckoning with the institution of U.S. Middle Passage slave trade, what do you think would be your first move? Can you even imagine? I know this, I'm throwing it at you, I should have warned you. Should have sent you a memo or something. But it's something I think about. Because, there's a lot of talk about reparations and all of these things, and we haven't reckoned. And how do we start?
Thank you for the softball question. I think one of the things I've learned from our experience building a relationship with the Beckers is how much work we need to do as a country towards that reckoning. And so I think part of it is, how do we talk about that history, and how do we make sure that all Americans understand that historical context? You think about in Germany, there are plaques on the homes where Jewish people were abducted from the home because of being taken to concentration camps. Here, we have statues to Confederate generals. Right? So we haven't, I don't think, acknowledged our history, which to me is a starting place for the work of reckoning and reconciliation. I think about the project that has begun in Montgomery, Alabama, at the lynching memorial, right? Where what they've done is to identify places where Black people were lynched throughout the United States. They have at the memorial in Montgomery, you walk amongst these sort of pillars that they've constructed that describe these lynchings that happened. And then they have a project, this is led by Brian Stevenson, the civil rights lawyer. They have a project to create monuments at the places where those lynchings took place throughout the United States. So they built a monument for the museum in Montgomery and a parallel monument that could be placed by communities where there was a lynching in their community. So to me, that's the kind of work that we need to engage in first. There's a conversation obviously to be had around what's the level of federal intervention that should take place to address the terrible disparities that we have, not just on the basis of race. Fundamentally, I don't think we should have a society where people die in the street for want of health care. So we should fix that. And we could if we had the political will to do so. So there's a lot that we need to do, but I think maybe it's a social studies teacher in me thinks part of the starting place is to have a civic culture where we have real acknowledgement of how we got to the place where we are.
Hi, thank you so much for this beautiful, beautiful memoir. I'm Dr. Maura Presley. I serve as the manager of the California Black Educator Initiative, and we're just so grateful for this contribution to this career. One of the things that really stood out for me in the book was the chapter where you talked about starting the school and how intentional you and your colleague were in interviewing the teachers that you would have to serve as your faculty. And I think about, even forward present day, how you did that amazing work of being very intentional about bringing staff that were passionate about teaching students, keeping them taken care of and retained right in that school. So my question for you is, as we think about supporting educators in the classroom, keeping them in the classroom, what would you suggest to myself as a teacher educator, a teacher supporter, as a professor, someone who values teachers in the classroom, someone who once was a classroom teacher and moved out of the classroom because of teacher burnout? What would you say we need to do as a society to make sure that we're taking care of our educators that are in the classroom?
Let's acknowledge there are some systemic things that we need to do that are very challenging in this political moment. We still should do them. We should pay teachers more, and we should address teacher working conditions. If you're working in that school where there's one counselor for 400 students, that is a working conditions problem that we should fix. We also have school buildings where the roof is leaking, where the temperature gets so hot in the summer. The city of Baltimore for many years has had to close schools in the summer, at the start of the summer, because it's too hot to be in the building. And with climate change, we're going to see more of that, right? So there are those working conditions issues we should address. But then I would say we don't approach the teaching career the way you would if you wanted people to come and stay. And, I talk about in the book the hardest job I've ever had, and I've had a lot of complicated jobs, was being a first-year teacher. It is incredibly difficult. You don't have files. You don't have experience to lean on. Everything is the first time it's happened, and it's overwhelming. It's incredibly stressful. It tests your sense of self. You go home every day agonizing. Did I say the right thing? Did I ask the right question? Not to mention needing to prepare things for tomorrow, which is the first time you've ever taught that lesson, right? So first year teaching is incredibly hard. So what could we do to make it so that those first few years are not so difficult for teachers? One is we should approach teacher preparation differently. In most schools around the country that do teacher preparation, you're talking about a few weeks of student teaching before you're handed your teaching license, as opposed to what I think it should be, a year-long residency where you're in the classroom of a master teacher throughout the year learning and preparing to teach. The way we think about medicine, right? We don't say come for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, check it out, what's happening in the hospital. And then we'll start bringing you patients, right? Like we have a more deliberate approach. I remember visiting a teacher prep program in Louisiana when I was secretary that had a residency program, but it also had students who did not participate in the residency. The residency was small. And one of the teachers who'd done the residency, he was in his first year, He said, you know what the best thing about my residency was? I knew what September looked like. Now, how many people in this room have taught elementary school? Right? What you know is that the whole game happens in September, right? That's when you set the routines, the habits, how we do things here in this classroom. Well, if your student teaching happens in the spring, you've never seen that. You don't know what the first day looks like, what the first week looks like, what the first month looks like. And so this young man said to me, you know, I knew how to start. My peers who just did student teaching, they didn't know how to start. So by January, they had a long list of things that they regretted about how the school year started and that they would do differently the next school year. So we should do that. We should have a residency program, and then we should have intensive induction support over those first few years of teaching. Right? My first year of teaching, no one ever observed my class. It was just me and the kids all year. I never got feedback from another adult. That is not the way to start a teaching career. I tell the story in the book that in my teacher preparation program, and I went to Columbia Teachers College, I learned a ton about teaching history content. We never talked about classroom management, not once. And we never talked about parents, not once. Well, it turns out, first day teaching 10th grade world history, classroom management was an important set of skills, right? And in terms of parents, I describe this story in the book. I remember this so clearly. When my principal comes up to me, I'm a first-year teacher, and says, parent-teacher conference is next week. Good luck. And I literally had this thought. What happens in parent-teacher conferences? I have no idea. I've never been to a parent-teacher conference. We never talked about it in my program. I said, I know. I remember on Growing Pains when Kirk Cameron got in trouble and Alan Thicke had to come to school. The teacher had pushed the two desks together in the center of the room. There was a stack of papers on the desk in front of the teacher. So parent-teacher conferences, I pulled two desks together in the center of my room. I had a stack of papers. Papers didn't have anything to do with anything. I just thought it looked serious. And then I waited for folks to come. But then, look, I hope it's better. No slight to Teachers College. I'm sure it's evolved since then. But I worry that that's indicative of teacher preparation that is sort of disconnected from the real world challenges of the classroom. And then the lack of mentoring means I didn't have someone to go to for support. So those are things that we could change. We should change them at the systemic level, but obviously the work that you're doing, the organization you're a part of, is trying to do that from a grassroots perspective.
One last question.
I have another softball question. So I just used Perplexity, and it says John B. King Jr. has had a complicated relationship with teacher unions. I would say, do you think they're part of the problem or part of the solution? Or duck the question, whatever you prefer.
I guess the way I would answer is yes, right? Where I think they're part of the solution is the advocacy for the level of resources that we need in schools. The strongest, most effective advocates have been teachers' unions. And you see this when you compare states that have teachers' unions with those that do not. Teachers' unions are a powerful voice for investment in public education. That is very important. Teachers' unions are also a powerful voice for addressing teacher working conditions. All the things that we were just talking about, right? They're a powerful leverage point. That said, I think, and this is part of the reason for the complicated relationship, I strongly believe that teacher effectiveness matters. I love teachers. This book is a love letter to teachers. And I also know that if I had a teacher who was indifferent to me, instead of Mr. Osterwell, I would not be sitting here today. I'd be dead or in prison. And so where I think there's work to do is we need to get to a place where we can say everyone should have due process. But if a teacher is not effectively helping their students to learn, if they're not creating a positive environment for students, we have to have a way to act on that. I remember a friend who was a principal, actually here in San Francisco. He had a teacher who would throw all the black boys out of the classroom. So he told her, you can't do that. Kept happening. So he started to observe more frequently. So when he was in the classroom, boys wouldn't get thrown out. As soon as he left, the African American boys get thrown out of class. Then he decided it was not going to be acceptable. He moved his office into her classroom, right? He literally would have people bring him notes if they needed something. He would sit in the back of the classroom because he was just determined that that was not going to be acceptable. She locked the door so that he couldn't come in. And that was the vehicle for actually being able to take some action. And to me, what that says is we have systems that where we've confused the purpose of the protections with our fundamental responsibility to students. And so that's where the complexity comes. And you know, I'm very close friends with leaders in the teachers union. We have these tough conversations about these things. And one of the things I appreciate about President Obama, there's some political risk in being willing to talk about those kinds of hard issues, but he was willing to because he understood the assignment. The assignment is about student outcomes. It is about ensuring schools that create a pathway to opportunity for every kid, including the kids who are most vulnerable.
Thank you both for this amazing evening.